The radio antenna cables felt cold beneath my fingers, even through my tactical gloves. I ran my hand along each connection, checking for loose joints, while the Afghan dawn painted the mountains blood red. The air tasted of diesel fuel and something else, something metallic that made my teeth ache. My name is Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, and I've been doing this dance for 8 years. Check the gear, trust the gear keeps you alive. But as I adjusted the radio frequency, my left hand trembled. Same motion I'd made 3 months ago, right before my last unit walked into hell. "Mitchell, you good?" Corporal Chen emerged from the comms tent, her GPS device beeping steadily in her palm. She was young, maybe 22, with the kind of precision that made her invaluable in the field. "Satellite imagery shows clear weather for insertion." I nodded, watching Private Rodriguez cross himself as he loaded fresh batteries into our night vision equipment. The kid whispered prayers over every piece of gear, a habit that used to annoy me. Now, it felt necessary. "Intel says the mountain pass has been quiet for 6 weeks," Captain Barnes called out, spreading maps across our makeshift table. His voice carried that particular strain I'd heard before, the sound of a man trying to convince himself as much as his soldiers. Taliban activity dropped off completely after the village elders started reporting strange sounds from the old Soviet outpost. I touched the dog tags beneath my uniform. 3 generations of Mitchells had worn these tags in wars that changed them forever. My grandfather in Korea, my father in Vietnam, and now me in Afghanistan. The weight felt heavier today. "Sir," Chen frowned at her equipment, tapping the GPS screen. "The magnetic compass is spinning, but digital navigation shows we're exactly where we should be. Could be mineral deposits in the mountains." I watched the compass needle dance in circles, and something cold settled in my stomach. In 8 years of combat, I'd learned to trust my instincts. Right now, they were screaming. The convoy rolled out as the sun cleared the jagged peaks. I watched the familiar FOB security fade behind us, replaced by increasingly isolated terrain. The air grew thicker with each mile, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The designated site sat in a natural depression surrounded by ancient stone formations that seemed to swallow sound. When our engines cut off, the silence hit like a physical blow. No birds, no insects, just the mechanical hum of our equipment and the taste of copper in the air. "Jesus," Sergeant Williams muttered, kicking at scattered Soviet ammunition casings. Our explosives expert was usually unshakable, but something in his voice had changed. "This place has seen action before." I crouched beside him, examining the shell casings mixed with older artifacts, pottery shards, and what looked like carved bone fragments. The markings on the stones around us were older than any modern conflict, worn smooth by centuries of wind and weather. "Set up the perimeter," I ordered, but my voice sounded hollow in the unnatural quiet. The team moved efficiently, but I noticed the changes. Rodriguez crossed himself more frequently. Chen double-checked readings that should have been routine. Even Barnes snapped at minor infractions he'd normally ignore. As we established the command post, the primary radio antenna began wrapping itself around the mounting bracket. There was no wind, not even a breeze, but the cables moved like living things, coiling and uncoiling in impossible patterns. "Sergeant," Chen called out, her voice tight with confusion, "the antenna keeps—" "I see it," I said, unwrapping the cables for the second time. They felt warm to the touch, almost pulsing. Secure it with zip ties. Neither of us acknowledged what we'd witnessed. In the military, you learn to compartmentalize the impossible. But as I worked, I found myself drawn to a particular section of the perimeter where the ancient stones formed a rough circle. Standing there, the world tilted. For a moment, I wasn't Staff Sergeant Mitchell. I was someone else, a soldier in a different uniform, facing something that made me scream until my throat bled. The vision lasted only seconds, but it left me gasping. "Mitchell?" Rodriguez appeared at my shoulder, his face pale. "You okay, Sergeant?" I nodded, not trusting my voice, but I wasn't okay. None of us were. The equipment failures started at 3 a.m. Jen's communication array powered on and off without input, cycling through frequencies that shouldn't exist. Static mixed with voices speaking in languages that predated radio technology. Words that seemed to crawl into my ears and nest there. I was on watch when the sulfur smell hit, thick and choking, like rotten eggs mixed with burning flesh. It shouldn't exist in the Afghan mountains, but it filled my nostrils until my eyes watered. The night vision goggles showed a cold spot near the stone circle, shaped like a human figure, but casting no shadow. "Rodriguez," I called into my radio. "You getting anything on thermal?" "Negative, Sergeant, all quiet." But it wasn't quiet. Through the static, I could hear children crying from the direction of the Soviet outpost, high, desperate wails that made my skin crawl. I switched to the command frequency. "Captain, we need to investigate those sounds." "What sounds, Mitchell?" The crying stopped, just like that, like someone had thrown a switch. We investigated anyway, moving through the ruins in standard formation. The Soviet outpost was a skeleton of concrete and rusted metal, empty rooms filled with shadows and more of those carved bone fragments. Williams swept for explosives, while Chen checked for electronic signatures. "Nothing here," Williams reported, but his usual confidence was gone. Just wind through the ruins. It wasn't wind. I knew it, and so did he. But admitting it meant admitting that 8 years of military training couldn't explain what was happening to us. Captain Barnes ordered a full equipment diagnostic, convinced that technical failures and stress were undermining our mission. But when the diagnostic showed all equipment functioning perfectly, despite the obvious malfunctions, something fundamental cracked in our chain of command. During daylight reconnaissance, we discovered the truth. The Soviet outpost wasn't just built on high ground, it was built over much older ruins. Stone foundations that the local guides had warned us about. Foundations that 3 previous military units had abandoned after reporting unexplained casualties and equipment failures. British colonial forces in 1919, Soviet troops in 1982, Northern Alliance fighters in 1998. All of them had left this place in terror, and all of them had buried their reports in classified archives. We should have left then, but orders are orders, and we were soldiers. Williams ran his ground-penetrating radar across the command post area, checking for hidden bunkers or weapons caches, standard procedure in a place like this. But the readings revealed something that made his hands shake.
"Sir,"
He called to Barnes, his voice barely above a whisper.
"there's a large void beneath us. Sealed chamber, maybe 20 feet down."
The chamber predated all modern military construction. The radar showed evidence of deliberate sealing, massive stones placed to keep something in, not out.
I should have ordered the team to pack up and relocate.
Every instinct I developed in 8 years of combat screamed at me to leave. Instead, I ordered the excavation. The compulsion was stronger than logic, stronger than training. It pulled at me like a physical force, the same way the stone circle had drawn my attention. My hands moved without conscious thought, directing the team to break through barriers that had stood for centuries. The chamber revealed itself slowly, like a wound opening in the earth. Soviet equipment lay scattered among British colonial-era weapons and carved totems that belonged in a museum. But it was the personal items that stopped my heart. Rodriguez's St. Christopher medal sat on a pile of ammunition, despite the fact that an identical medal hung around his neck. Chen's backup radio, the one that should have been in her pack, rested beside reports written in my own handwriting about missions that had never happened.
"This isn't possible,"
Chen whispered, her precise technical mind fracturing as she tried to rationalize the impossible. She held up a folder marked with my name, filled with detailed accounts of operations I'd never conducted at coordinates I'd never visited. Rodriguez pulled out his medal, comparing it to the one in the chamber, identical down to the smallest scratch. His faith, which had been his anchor, transformed into something desperate and terrifying.
We need to get out of here,
William said, backing away from the artifacts. But as he spoke, the chamber began to resonate with a low-frequency hum that our equipment couldn't detect but that we felt in our bones. I realized with growing horror that by opening the chamber, we hadn't just discovered something ancient, we'd awakened it, and it had been waiting specifically for us.
The thing that rose from the chamber wasn't a shadow. It was the absence of light itself, a massive black void in the shape of something that might once have been human, but had been twisted by centuries of rage and hunger. The stench of sulfur and burning flesh intensified until we could taste it on our tongues.
"Contact!" William shouted, but his voice broke on the word. How do you engage a target that exists outside the laws of physics? I emptied my magazine into the center mass. The bullets passed through without effect, striking the chamber walls and ricocheting back at us. Williams tried his explosives, but the charges detonated harmlessly, while the entity studied us with predatory patience. Chen's equipment turned against her, broadcasting the screams of soldiers who had died in this place across decades of conflict. British voices crying out in colonial accents mixed with Soviet soldiers pleading in Russian, and Northern Alliance fighters praying in Dari. All of them had faced this thing. All of them had failed. The entity's psychological assault began immediately. It knew things about us, intimate details that no intelligence briefing could have provided. It showed me the IED explosion that had killed my last unit, but with the roles reversed. In the vision, I was the one who triggered the blast, watching my men die because of my failure to spot the signs. It's not real, I told myself, but the guilt felt real enough. The entity fed on that guilt, growing stronger with each moment of self-doubt. Captain Barnes suffered a complete command breakdown. One moment he was denying the supernatural events, the next he was screaming contradictory orders to fight an enemy that military doctrine couldn't address. The chain of command collapsed as we each realized we were fighting for individual survival. Rodriguez's prayers seemed to make the entity stronger, as if his faith was fuel for its malevolence. Chen's technical expertise became a weapon against her as her own equipment hunted her through the compound, servo motors whining as they tracked her movement. The entity hurled chunks of ancient stone with lethal precision, manipulating our environment to create death traps. It knew our fears, our weaknesses, our psychological pressure points. The FOB became a supernatural battlefield where the terrain itself had turned hostile. The NOP communication with higher command became impossible. The entity manipulated our equipment to broadcast false distress signals and contradictory orders. One moment we were ordered to hold position, the next to evacuate immediately. The static-filled transmissions carried voices of dead soldiers, and we couldn't tell which orders were real. We were cut off, isolated, left to face something that had been feeding on military trauma for over a century. Military Chaplain Thompson arrived on what should have been a routine morale visit. His helicopter touched down just as the entity's attacks intensified, and his presence seemed to create a protective barrier around our position. For the first time in days, the supernatural pressure lifted slightly. "This isn't about your weapons," he told us, his voice calm despite the chaos. "It's about your souls. This thing feeds on violence and fear. Every soldier who's faced it has made it stronger by trying to fight it with conventional methods. Thompson's approach required us to abandon everything we'd been trained to believe. No equipment, no tactics, just faith and the willingness to face our deepest fears without the comfort of military protocol. Williams disappeared during a supply run. We found him later in the sealed chamber, alive but aged decades in the span of hours. His expertise was gone, replaced by knowledge of things that no living person should understand. He spoke in languages that predated civilization, describing geometries that made my brain ache. "It's hungry," he whispered, his eyes reflecting light that wasn't there. "It's been hungry for so long." I realized then that the entity wasn't just feeding on our fear. It was feeding on the violence and trauma associated with this location. Every military unit that had occupied this ground had added to its power through their deaths, their terror, their desperate attempts to fight the unfightable. The only way to weaken it was to break the cycle.
The choice came down to protocol or faith.
Military doctrine demanded that I call for extraction and potential airstrike, but Chaplain Thompson's approach required something I'd never been trained for: spiritual warfare. The entity manifested at full strength, incorporating elements of every soldier who had died on this cursed ground. British colonial uniforms mixed with Soviet gear and Northern Alliance equipment, all twisted into a towering figure of malevolent intelligence. "You have to choose," Thompson told me as the entity advanced. "Fight it with weapons and feed its power, or face it with something it can't consume. Redemption." I made the hardest decision of my military career. I holstered my weapon and ordered my men to do the same. In the sealed chamber, where the entity's power was strongest, we would make our stand using methods that had nothing to do with military training. The ancient protective symbols carved into the chamber walls began to glow as Thompson led us through a ritual that required brutal honesty. We had to face our deepest fears and guilt while maintaining the tactical discipline that had kept us alive. I confessed to the deaths of my previous unit, accepting responsibility for signs I'd missed and decisions I'd made. Chen admitted her terror of technical failure, the fear that her expertise would fail when it mattered most. Even Barnes found the courage to acknowledge his failure as a leader. But it was Rodriguez who made the ultimate sacrifice. His faith, tested and purified by terror, became the key to binding the entity. As we prepared to escape, he stepped forward. "I'll stay," he said, his voice steady for the first time in days. Someone has to maintain the barrier. Rodriguez's death wasn't violent, it was transcendent. His body remained behind as a guardian spirit, binding the entity to the location permanently. The protective symbols flared with brilliant light, and the supernatural pressure that had been crushing us finally lifted. We escaped from the chamber, but the cost was enormous. The entity was contained, but not destroyed, and the experience had fundamentally changed every survivor. We carried knowledge that would isolate us forever from our fellow soldiers.
The military classified the incident as equipment failure and combat stress. Our reports were buried in classified archives, and we were transferred to different units with psychological evaluations that labeled us as suffering from shared combat-induced psychosis. FOB Charlie was abandoned and marked as a geological hazard zone. The official reason was unstable ground conditions, but I knew the truth. They were ensuring no future military presence would disturb Rodriguez's sacrifice. The PTSD was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Standard military counselors couldn't help with trauma that included supernatural elements. When I tried to warn others about the location, my warnings were dismissed as combat-induced paranoia. Chen left the service entirely, unable to trust the technology that had defined her career. Williams was medically discharged after his encounter in the chamber left him speaking in tongues and drawing symbols that hurt to look at. Barnes never took another field command. 5 years later, I learned through unofficial channels that the military was planning to reopen the area for a new strategic outpost.
The geological survey had been reversed, and FOB Charlie was back on the deployment schedule. I tried to contact the planning committee, but my calls were ignored. My service record had been flagged, my warnings dismissed as the ravings of a combat veteran who couldn't let go of past trauma. But I know the truth. The entity's influence may be spreading beyond the original location. The symbols Williams had drawn before his discharge, I've started seeing them spray painted on walls in military towns across the country, always near bases where soldiers have reported equipment failures and strange dreams. Rodriguez's sacrifice contained the entity, but it didn't destroy it. And if new soldiers set foot in that cursed place, they'll face the same choice we did: feed its power with violence, or find the strength to break the cycle. I've been having dreams lately, dreams of ancient stones and sulfur-scented air, dreams of soldiers in different uniforms, all facing the same impossible choice. The entity is patient. It's waited centuries for feeding opportunities, and it can wait centuries more. But I won't let it happen again. Not if I can help it. Not if I can warn them in time. This is FOB Charlie. Request immediate support. Something's wrong with the equipment. Something's wrong with everything. It's starting again. The supernatural doesn't respect military boundaries. Subscribe for more real encounters that challenge everything we think we know about warfare, and comment with your own unexplained military experiences.